Hello, my name is Jason Hadjinikidis, and I'm here to talk to you today about risk management Lafferism. So, let's get into it. So, my name is Jason Hadjinikidis. I've worked in research, mining, oil and gas, waste management, mining regulation, pharmaceuticals, government, both state and Commonwealth. I've worked in drug enforcement. I've worked in heavy manufacturing. I've worked in primary production. I've worked in building products and defence. So I've got a very broad range of experiences from a lot of different industries that I like to pull together, and I work as a risk specialist for those organisations. I'm the principal of a company called Risk Control Ashore, and in that company I tend to give advice to a whole lot of businesses around how to better manage their risk management frameworks, especially in high risk industries and especially around making things simple. I'm a big believer that you need to keep things simple. Risk can be as complicated as we want, or it can be as simple as we want. And I'm much preferred to make things as simple as possible. I like to go in and demystify. I like to go in and make it straightforward. My view is that the easier it is, the more likely it is going to be used. So, I'm going to go through a bit of an agenda today on my short presentation. We'll firstly talk about the fundamentals. I just want to touch on the fundamentals of risk management. And it might seem like an odd thing to do in such a forum, but I just want to get our language straight so that during the course of my presentation, when I make certain statements about certain aspects of risk management, we're all aligned on the same view. So we'll cover the fundamentals, then we'll talk about risk realisation and what happens in an organisation when a risk realises. I'll touch on the Laffer curve, which is actually in the title of my subject here. I won't touch on what that means at the moment. I'll get to that at dot point 3. We'll then talk in detail about controls. We'll talk about the unintended consequences of the controls. We'll talk about governance, effective assurance, active monitoring, audits, and leading indicators. So that'll round out my presentation, and I should come in at just under 30 minutes, which is all you have to listen to me harping on about now. So, the fundamentals. What I've got here is the fundamental of risk management, as I like to put it. It's about risks, it's about controls, and it's about assurance. And what we do in any organisation is we identify and analyse risks, we determine the best controls to prevent risk realisation or to mitigate realised consequences, and then we provide assurance to the boards, to the executives and the business that the risks are controlled to as low as reasonably practicable level via assurance activities. And it's a cycle: risk, control, assure, goes round, and once we've got good assurance in place of the controls, we can then better improve our risk identification and analysis. So, risk realisation. Risks are managed through control frameworks in organisations. You can't manage a risk without a control framework. By definition, you have to have a control that manages the risk. And control owners in the organisation are responsible for that. I often say that in every organisation, people only have a job because they have responsibility for managing a risk, either through a control or through some form of assurance. Now, when a risk realises, what an organisation typically does is it conducts an investigation. Now, I've put up two pictures there. The first one is just a typical cycle of investigation where there's immediate action taken, investigation gets planned, data is collected, data is analysed, corrective actions are raised, and then there's reporting on the investigation. Typically, the corrective actions are control actions, are assurance actions. Now, the other picture there is a book by Dietrich Dorner, The Logic of Failure, which is an absolutely outstanding book. It's one of the books I recommend to everybody, especially if they're involved in investigations, because it challenges the theory of cause and effect. And it demonstrates through a number of examples where it is not immediately obvious that an effect is because of a single cause, that it's not often a linear response. Now, this cycle itself that I've put there does lend itself to a linear response, and I would encourage everybody to read Dietrich's book. It's an outstanding read. It's a very short read. I've taken that photo off the book on my shelf, so I read and recommend it, and I'd recommend everybody here to read it as well. But back to my talk. So, typical of the corrective actions are control improvements. Now, additional controls are often put in place, and occasionally additional assurances. But mostly people tend to say, great, let's put in some more controls because something obviously went wrong. Now, these controls may be in the form of additional procedures, checklists, tick boxes, different steps in the procedure, more work instructions, software algorithms, pieces of software that then act to prevent the risk from being realised by performing certain checks in the background, engineered barriers or aids, And even PPE in the case of safety can be additional controls. The safety glasses didn't work, well, wear safety glasses and a safety shield. And then often, when it's more of a nebulous risk realisation, such as the performance of the organisation in certain parts is not where it needs to be, we'll put in improvement initiatives. And they can be a number of improvement initiatives. Now, let me introduce the Laffer curve and pose this question. Can I have too many controls? My argument here is it's very, very simple for organisations to put in additional controls without actually understanding what they're doing, understanding why they're doing it, and that can lead to a problem that I'm going to refer to as Lafferism. Now, to illustrate what the Laffer curve is, I'm going to jump to a video, and it's a video from an outstanding 80s movie called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Those of you who are at my vintage, which is very much the wrong side of 50, will understand that Ferris Bueller was a fantastic foundation movie, and I'm just going to show you a very short clip from an actor called Ben Stein as he talks about the Laffer curve.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the the Great Depression, passed the the tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
So there you have it, Ben Stein talking about voodoo economics. It's a shame he didn't show you the curve, but I'll show you the curve shortly. Now, let me just explain the Laffer curve in the detail that you need to understand it. So an American economist, Arthur Laffer coined the term, hence the name. And in 1974, he dined with the Ford administration officials, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. And just so that people are clear, that's President Ford, US President, not Ford Motor Car Administration. Now, Professor Laffer drew a curve on a napkin, and that was coined the Laffer curve by one of those present. And the Laffer curve is often represented as a graph that looks like a semicircle with zero revenue, rising to a maximum revenue at a particular tax, and then rolling over down to zero revenue at 100% tax. Clearly, if I take 100% tax from you, you're not going to work. So what does the Laffer curve actually look like? Now, I've chosen to draw this on my whiteboard in my home office because we're all working at home office with COVID, and things can be a little tough at times. And I figured most of the people listening to these presentations during this conference will see some very, very polished material. So I thought the way to keep things front of mind is to perhaps not do it as polished. So I've drawn this on my whiteboard and then taken a photo. And I do apologise for the quality of my drawing. So this is the Laffer curve, as I've just described. On the x-axis, you have tax from 0% to 100%. If I take no tax, I have no tax revenue. If I take all of your income in tax, I will also have no revenue because people will just stop working if they're working and not earning any money. But somewhere in the middle there, and maybe it's not the middle, maybe it's further to the left, to the right, there is a point of maximum revenue where the revenue is as big as I can get it before I take too much tax, and people will then choose not to work for cultural issues predominantly. Now, that's what the Laffer curve looks like. It's a financial curve. It's a financial instrument. It's not a risk management model. It is not a model that's used anywhere outside of economics. But I thought, well, this seems pretty logical to me to apply this also to risk management. And how does it apply to risk management? Well, I've redrawn the graph again on my whiteboard, and again, I took a feeble picture of it to show you all. This is what it's like. So on the x-axis, I've put the number of controls. And on the y-axis, I've put the risk management framework efficacy. And then somewhere in the middle is a maximum. So what I claim is that as an organisation increases the number of controls in its risk management framework, the risk management efficacy improves, but it gets to a point where there's too many controls in place, and the efficiency or efficacy of the risk management framework will in fact roll over. We will get a less effective risk management framework by introducing control after control after control. It's just a logical step from I do no controls, I will have no efficient risk management, to have 100% control, if I can be so bold as to phrase it as that. I will again end up with an inefficient risk management framework. But somewhere in the middle, there will be an optimum efficiency of my risk management framework. So what is risk management Lafferism? So I'll coin this phrase now, and here's my definition. It's a situation in risk management where the unbalanced increase in controls results in a less effective control framework and hence a higher likelihood of risk realisation. Now, I underlined unbalanced there to make a point. There's nothing wrong with increasing controls. Nothing wrong at all. It's the unbalanced increase in controls that causes issues. It's the, we better put another control in. Ooh, we saw that this didn't work. Maybe we need something else as well as. And it's putting it in without it being balanced with the entire risk management framework with which that realised risk operates. So, what is the problem with too many controls? So if you have too many controls in an organisation, you keep putting in additional controls, it's the additional workload without additional resources. Many times in organisations I've seen a risk being realised and people have said, well, we'll add 3 dot points to the bottom of that checklist. We'll add 4 extra steps in that procedure. It's not a lot of extra work. We don't need additional people. We'll just get everybody to do a little bit of an extra check. And it might be a minute here. It might be 5 minutes there. It might be 10 minutes here. But risks realise almost continuously. And when they do, and you continually add more and more controls, you end up with a significant extra workload, and then that has a significant impact on the workforce. You also then get overlapping of control aspects. You get controls that overlap and are essentially doing the same thing, but in an identical way. You start to get waste. Why is this procedure telling me to do these 5 steps, and that procedure over there has also duplicated 2 of those steps? This doesn't make sense. Similarly, you can get into control conflict. When controls, when they're put in place without a judicious discussion of the existing controls, can in fact cause ambiguity, or it can in fact cause conflict where there are contradictory controls being placed in managing a risk. These can result in increased complexity of the control framework. Again, I've taken a photo of a book off my shelf and I put up there, and I strongly encourage everybody in risk management to read this book. It's Normal Accidents by Charles Perrow. It's a foundational text. And Charles Perrow introduces the concept of complex organisations and tightly coupled organisations. A complex organisation is one such that there is so much complexity that no one person can understand the entirety of the organisation. And the tightly coupled means that when a small perturbation in the system can result in large problems, a bit of a butterfly effect. Now, as you increase complexity of the control framework, it becomes very, very difficult to understand how well and efficient your control framework is operating to prevent risk realisation. There's also the increased perception of reduced likelihood of risk realisation. So the workforce can think, oh, okay, well, this isn't as risky. And even top management can think, well, this isn't as risky now to me. And they focus on the likelihood of risk realisation being reduced rather than the consequence of that risk being realised. And that can be a cultural issue that the organisation starts to face. There's also the potential for confusion as to which controls are most effective. And you can get a workforce who are under some stress at times being, let's just say, inventive in their choice of controls they use. They may choose under a tight time frame to feel that they can't achieve all of the control work they need to do, and then picking the new controls over the existing controls. There's also the Peltzman effect. And of course, the Peltzman effect is a commonly discussed effect, and it's one that says that in any risk environment, when there's additional controls that have been put in place, people will modify their behaviour to meet the level of risk that they're comfortable taking. These controls are like O-rings in an engine. This is the analogy I like to use. So in an engine, you have a series of O-rings and seals and gaskets. When one of them has a problem, maybe it's leaking, what you don't do is put another O-ring on top of that O-ring, seal up the engine and turn it back on. Because what normally happens is you won't see any issue with that double O-ring when the engine is idling. But it's when the strain and the load gets put on that will leak. It is a guarantee that 2 O-rings in a line will leak when they're in contact with each other. And so that's the way it is with controls. When you put in an additional control, you might find that, hey, it's working. We've got this additional control because there's no real conflict between the controls. There's no real overlap that I'm seeing. But when the pressure's on, that's when the stress is under the control framework, and that's when we're likely to see control failures. Now, there's also the unintended consequences of additional controls. Now, large or small, they can cause significant issues. And the one that I like to think of immediately is the additional control of cane toads that were introduced in Australia, which, as many of us know, were introduced to control the cane beetle. Wasn't effective because the cane beetles were up on the cane and the frogs were down on the ground. Couldn't get to the beetles. What a surprise, wasn't effective. But the unintended consequence of an ineffective control was the plague of cane toads that now inhabit Australia and are travelling every day. They seem to be spreading more and more around Australia. Another example is passenger side airbags in cars. When passenger side airbags were placed in cars, what happened was an improvement in the safety of people who were involved in accidents, but it forced children to not be placed in the front seat. Children were then placed in the rear seats in cars, which is not a significant outcome on face value. However, studies have shown there is a correlation now between the timing in which, I should say, children started to sit in the rear of cars more predominantly, and the number of children that were left unattended in cars with sometimes dire consequences. That correlation does exist. And then thirdly, I'd like to give the example of the bacteria side for Legionella and the IBM tapes. So there's an example in the literature of bacteria side, which has got a tin compound in it, which was introduced into a cooling tower in a building that was run by IBM. And in that building, in the cooling towers, they found the Legionella. They introduced the bacteria side. It killed the Legionella. And then they started to notice that their backup tapes were failing, and they couldn't figure out why. They then saw that the backup tapes, when they did the analysis, had a high tin content. They then correlated back to the introduction of the bacteria side, noticed that the backup tapes were all stored underneath particular vents, and found that the tin that was being translated out of the cooling tower in very small amounts was in fact infecting the IBM tapes. Now, the real guru in unintended consequences is a gentleman called Edward Tenner, and Edward Tenner, and one of my favourite books of all time, is Why Things Bite Back, which goes into great detail around this. And I can thank Edward for a couple of these examples, which I've shamelessly referenced him as the author, who gives a much better explanation of these unintended consequences than I ever will. And I'd encourage everybody to read Edward's book on Why Things Bite Back. So, the key to the situation that I've just explained to you, that too much control can be a problem, is to set up governance. Governance is the key. And the fundamental of good governance is getting the right people in the room. Too often I have seen governance committees in organisations that are populated by executives, middle managers with perhaps a subject matter expert who might be a risk manager, might be a safety manager, might be a quality manager, might be an IT manager. Too often I see that, and what happens is the good idea comes about from the investigation of the realised risk, and people around the room who aren't necessarily the users nod politely and say, okay, let's do that additional control. The assessment of the control failure needs to be done rigorously at that governance committee. And there's all the different layers of governance committee. There can be that governance committee at the board. There can be the governance committee that sits on the site and involves a handful of people, but it must always involve the users. And the assessment of the control failure has to be absolutely accurate, because often you need to make sure that it's actually a failed control and not a failed application of the control. I've often seen where it's not the control that's problematic, it's the way that control has been applied. You then need to also verify the competence of the people using the controls, and it may be a human factor in the control design. While the design is ideal and functional, there may be a human factor that's considered there in terms of the human beings who are using these controls that cause the control to not be as effective as one would think, and henceforth the control is blamed rather than the human factor. And it may be a cultural factor. There may be cultural issues that actually prevent the controls we have in place from being effective. Now, what the governance committee should also do, and the governance group should look at, was it an assurance that was absent? Often I've seen the controls have allegedly failed because there wasn't an effective assurance that gave the indication that the control was not ideal or the control was heading towards failure. There's nothing wrong with having controls that are designed to fail. We have those sorts of things in many, many situations. The first one that springs to my mind is sacrificial anodes. Engines, and I come from a background of sea and salt water. Engines, boats, they often have sacrificial anodes that degrade before engine parts do to ensure that the engine is protected. Sacrificial control. So the determination if an assurance was absent is critical, and consider the improvement of insurance rather than the addition of controls. It's something that a governance committee should always ask. Do we need to improve the control, or is it the assurance around the control that really needs to be jumped on here? Now, effective assurance. I just want to explain what, in my view, effective assurance is. So there's a number of aspects. The first one is active monitoring, and I'll explain what this is shortly in more detail. Active monitoring is finding out what's going on, going and checking in often and finding out how the controls are working. Audits clearly are a part of assurance, going and doing an effective audit. And reports. Lots and lots of reports we all run, but the important reports are the ones that have leading indicators. Now let me just unpack active monitoring, auditing, and leading indicators. Now active monitoring, what is it? I like to define active monitoring as going out and sense checking the occasional or the frequent controls we have in place. And I use the example here of a friend of mine who works as one of the most preeminent risk experts globally. He gets called from an oil major's head of refinery to say, hey, could you come and help me? I've got a whole bunch of refineries under my responsibility, and one of them I'm not confident that they're performing well because their performance is too good. And so my contact goes out there, introduces himself to this particular refinery manager and says, hey, I'm from head office, I'm here to help. And the refinery manager says, well, okay, you can help, but I'm busy. And so my contact thinks, okay, busy, of course, you're not engaged. This is why your performance is so much probably worse, but you're covering up. Okay, let's just see what happens here. And my contact said, well, can I participate in what you're about to do? And the refinery manager walks out into the refinery. And the refinery manager walks out, interacts with the workforce and asks simple questions. Hello, how are you? What's the biggest issue you've got at the moment? What's the best thing that I can do to help you? Goes through the refinery asking these questions of people, writes a list of things that the observations of the refinery manager. Now my contact observes this, goes back after an hour or so walking through the refinery, and then sits with this manager and says, well, may we have our meeting now? And the manager says, look, I'm sorry, I'm too busy. And of course my contact thinks, yeah, of course, too busy now, getting back to catch up on what you should have done. And the refinery manager instead puts his phone to one side, his mobile, his laptop, and picks up the desk phone and starts making phone calls. And he reads from the list and says things such as, hey, I was just out talking to this person and they told me that this part of the control system has actually failed. I need you to get onto this. So they then went and engaged and followed up on everything they were advised. And so this refinery manager finishes making the calls, turns to my contact and says, can we have our meeting now? My contact says, I don't need to. I can clearly see why your performance is better than others. It's because you are actively monitoring your business and you are preventing issues before they arise. Now, audit. Audit is critical. I'm going to make a claim here that an audit is an investigation of an unrealised risk. An audit is an investigation of an unrealised risk. An audit is about checking that the controls are in place, they're functional, but it's before the risk is realised. And an investigation is actually an audit of a realised risk. It's when the risk is realised, controls have failed, and we're now doing an investigation. The skill set should be the same, and I believe that auditors would make an absolute outstanding set of investigators if they were given the opportunity. And in many organisations, I've seen auditors who are outstanding being looked over to not participate in investigations. And similarly, in audits, I've seen some outstanding investigators who haven't been involved. Then there's leading indicators. And a leading indicator I'd like to define as a measurement which provides an indication of the health of a preventive or a corrective control. It's the leading indicators and that indication of the health of a preventive or corrective control that is the nub of it. It's about knowing when that control that prevents that risk from being realised is not as healthy, it's not as efficient, it's not as simple as we thought, and it's getting that leading indicator up before the governance board to actually make a value judgment about, wow, these controls are heading towards failure. Now, again, as I've said previously, it's not always about just introducing new controls. It is often about, it's not the control, it's an assurance. So this is where I think if we have a better set of leading indicators, that can often point towards a set of controls which are potentially not as effective as we thought they were. Assurance and leading indicators should look at the effectiveness of the control framework. It's a simple approach. And some have said to me it's a subtle approach, where I think it's more of an obvious approach, that our assurance framework should be focusing on the controls we have in place, and the leading indicators should be telling us the health of those controls. And a leading indicator should be able to say, okay, this control is heading towards failure. So, summarising. Now, I know it's only been a short session here, and I'm coming close to the 25-minute mark on this talk. So I'd just like to summarise all of the points I've made during this presentation. Too many controls may be as bad as too few. If I have a control framework that is cumbersome, that is complex, there's overlapping, there's waste, it drives confusion, it drives complexity, as I've spoken before, and complex systems can result in failure. And Perot's book, Normal Accidents, is called Normal Accidents because his view is that accidents can become normal if the control framework gets out of hand and overly complex. Always consider the controls may be fine. It's something that I know is almost contradictory to what I've said before, but when a control fails, we need to really get the governance group, whatever layer that is, to consider that control and say, you know, that control, I don't think there's a problem with the control. It may be the implementation of it. It may be the way that we assure ourselves that that control is effective. We need to check its implementation. Certainly and obviously there are times when the implementation of the control has been ineffective. We need to make sure it's properly assured, as I've said. We need to make sure that our indicator suite do point towards our control framework and that there is a correlated mapping between our control framework and the way we do audits. Get your governance groups correctly populated. You need to have people who are the control users in your governance groups, not just the people who are in charge of the risk. I've often seen in organisations risk owners. And when I've asked the question of, okay, well, that's the person who owns the risk, who owns the controls? To which I've sat and heard crickets in the background because people have thought, what do you mean, who owns the controls? The workers own the controls. The workers don't own the controls. The organisation own the controls. And so getting your governance groups correctly populated have the cross-section of people who are at all levels of control. You want the people who control the risks, the people that control the controls, people that are responsible for the assurances, and the end users of all the systems, processes, activities that we put into businesses. Make sure your assurance is balanced. And by balanced, I mean it has to comprise a certain amount of active monitoring. And the active monitoring is going out, finding what's going on, doing the occasional sense check on the controls that are supposed to be in place, doing that assessment. Often, auditors, when they go out and conduct an audit, people are on their best behaviour. But once you build a relationship with your workforce and you frequently go out there and actively monitor the organisation, you find a whole lot of controls that you may have thought were working well might be not quite as efficient as you thought. Secondly, as I said, audit. You can't do anything but do a good audit. Do a good audit and see it as an investigation on an unrealised risk. I can't impress that enough. An audit is the investigation of a non-realised risk, and an investigation is an audit of a realised risk. I think the two sets of skills match each other beautifully, and with that mindset and the basis of risk control assure in the background, I think that's a clear way to provide clarity to thinking in the governance groups. And lastly, leading indicators, as I've said. A leading indicator, I know I've banged on about this quite a bit, a leading indicator is your best friend. You get your leading indicators right, it's like the dashboard in your car that shows the oil temperature light comes on when it's flashing. It shows the temperature of the engine starts to rise. It's those leading indicators that tell you may have a problem shortly. And it's all about telling you the health of your preventive controls is your best leading indicators. So that's my summary, that's my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've harped on for a little bit. I put a little bit of a video in there to make it a bit more entertaining that you may have all fallen asleep like that teaches students. Similarly, I might have been not as clear in what I've tried to describe to you, but I hope you've enjoyed my talk. Please contact me. I'm available through LinkedIn. You can look me up. Available through the conference here. I'll be happy to engage and talk about this subject pretty much until the cows come home because I'm very, very passionate about risk management. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll